The American people have demanded that they go big. And it's not, they don't just want a bill dealing with tax reform. They want substantial change to the way the government functions. They want the border closed. They want inflation to come down. They want crime rates to drop. They want folks to start acting in a way that is not weaponizing government agencies against the people. They want spying on American citizens to stop. They want their votes to count and illegals to not be allowed to vote in federal elections or even state and local elections. Regardless of which strategy they go about, it needs to be a big and massive a piece of policy change.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown, but before we get to the interview, we'd love it if you'd hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review because we love your feedback. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works and how to affect real change. Without further ado, here's the interview. Ryan Walker, welcome to the Signal Sitdown. So you are the Executive Vice President of Heritage Action for America. And we thought there'd be nobody better to talk to as we preview the next Congress than someone whose day and night job is to make sure that conservative priorities are put in front of these legislators and eventually make their way to the president's desk. So thank you for coming on to the show.
Thanks for having me.
First, I guess I want you to talk about how you got here, how you became one of the leaders of HAFA and all the work that you guys do to make sure that conservative priorities are listened to in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, a good question. I was in college.
How do you work in government and actually are a conservative? Yeah,
I didn't really have a political. I wasn't overly eager on the political side when I was entering college, but I had a professor when I was a sophomore who really turned me on to it. And at that age, I thought I was going to. I thought I would join the UN, start working for the UN. I thought that I liked international relations and that whole policy bend, and that I would change the world. I'd go into the UN and do great things. But anyway, so because of that desire, I got a couple internships on Capitol Hill and very quickly got a substantial education on politics and how Congress works and or at least a little bit of an insight. Obviously, as an intern, you don't do too much of substance, but you can observe and you can watch. And so I did that for almost a year. I did 2 internships on Capitol Hill, and then right when I graduated, I moved up and started working in a congressional office and worked on the House side on Capitol Hill for 10 years for 2 different members from North Carolina. And I fulfilled every sort of role in the congressional office, everything from legislative correspondence. I was answering emails and letters from constituents. And by the time I left and came over to Heritage Action, I was deputy chief of staff and running the day-to-day of the D.C. office for the member that I was working for. Mm-hmm. And then I came over here in 2020.
It's funny, I remember getting the itch for politics too. And I knew that I wanted to get into politics at a very young age. I think I was 15 or 16. And I was like, I think I want to go get my law degree and then I want to be involved in politics. And the only reason that I initially thought that was because I had a really large interest in American history and loved watching, the Sunday shows with my parents when I was a little kid. And like, there's just fond memories there. I knew I was really interested in American history and the political landscape. But I also had a bunch of different weird other interests. Like I was really into conservation and I was really into, the natural world. And so I was like, how do I mix all of these interests together? And it's a bit of a condemnation on Washington, D.C. that the federal government is involved in all of these things, but it does have some role to play, whether it's a neutral observer that sets the rules of the road, or it's much more involved in an issue area like national security or immigration. It was the only industry that I could really get into that touched all of those things.
Right.
And I remember doing an internship on Capitol Hill as well for the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where my hometown representative was the chairman of that committee, Representative Ed Royce. And when I came and interned for him, he knew why I had wanted to get into politics in the first place. And he said, you know what? I want you to work with our state and DOD liaison for the committee and do some research with them on different committee issues. But I also want you to help my staff prepare for this CODEL that we're doing in Africa. And it's not only about the political situation, it's about conservation efforts. We did some stuff on shark fishing, all this weird stuff that I was like, oh, I actually have the itch for this because I'm able to touch these different issue areas that I feel passionate about. But what specifically about that professor gave you the itch?
Well, it's an involvement in the political system, and we talked a lot about in that class the philosophy behind the American Republic and the original texts of the founders of the country, reading Federalist Papers and things like that, to actually understand what they thought we would be doing in 2024 as a nation and as a government, and how radically different their vision is than what we're doing now. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because I grew up in high school. It was when I was in high school, the punk rock scene, if you will, was very popular. I listened to punk rock music. The whole ethos of the punk sort of genre sort of infiltrated myself and the peers that I had surrounding me, and it's been interesting to me as I've grown up. I'm now 36, married, 3 kids, and so I've been in this town for more than a decade, obviously, almost 15 years now, which is sort of depressing in a number of ways to say. But I mixed that interest in wanting to be a part of the government, and to your point, the federal government is so big and so expansive that it does touch on, if you have an interest in anything, chances are the federal government has some sort of inroad or rulemaking or they're establishing and setting the parameters for all of that. And so I had an interest in that, being civically engaged. This professor just, the way that we were learning about the intellectual underpinnings of the American Revolution, it just compelled me to want to get involved. But then I also had this sort of inherent and internal problem with authority that came from the punk rock era and the punk rock genre. And that's kind of a weird thing to talk about, but it has certainly colored my perspective and how I view Washington and how I interpreted the original text that we were reading and things like that. And I knew I wanted to get involved, and getting up here and learning how the sausage is made and how much the federal government does, it sort of radicalizes you against a lot of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up punk rock, because I have written previously on this in other publications, and I think one of the biggest contradictions right now on the right is that we are messaging ourselves as the movement of normal people while also messaging ourselves as the punk rock movement. And so are you a normie? Are we normies or are we punk rock? And I think the only way you can really thread that needle is making a really strong rhetorical argument that the establishment has never been and will never be normal people. And the establishment is made up of this wide-ranging collection of freaks who want complete power. And the only way you can do that is to encourage normies to get a little bit of that punk rock edge to them and to say, no, I'm rejecting everything that the establishment or everything that the Uniparty or the globalists or whatever you want to call them, I'm rejecting everything that those people are doing because I'm not a freak. There's some middle school bully mentality that I think the American people are adopting in this phase. It's just interesting to see that unfold.
Well, yeah, I mean, inherently, if you look back at the history of the country, it's sort of been there since the beginning, right? This rejection of centralized power, this rejection of an authoritarian, the rejection of the monarchy, the rejection of centralized control, the whole idea of federalism and state governments and governors and all that. The whole system was sort of designed to break down centralized power. And at least from my perspective and what I experienced during high school and my youth, is that the punk rock genre, or punk rock generally speaking, sort of embodies all that, right?
Yeah.
It is sort of questioning authority. It's questioning where all of these rules and strictures come from, why we have all these rules. And so I think there's a symbiosis between the average American person and the mentality of punk rock mixed with, the revolutionary spirit of the United States. It's all, there's some commonality there. And I think it's fascinating because we're all, to your point about elites, now the Republican Party is sort of the rejectionist party. They're rejecting the elite, and they're taking up this problem with authority. So anyway, it's sort of in my core. It's still, I still feel it. Still at bit of an emotional edge when Congress starts acting in a certain way or the executive does. It's just, and I think it's true that most Americans have that inherently in them.
Yeah, inside every American, there's a punk rocker yearning to be free.
That's right. That's right.
But, of course, I think a lot of us get into politics because we have a civics teacher or a professor or somebody who comes along and really presents the case for America, the case for American liberty, in a really thoughtful and engaging way. And that pulls so many of us in. And I think sadly, and I'm not saying there isn't a place for this, of course, in the conservative movement, but I think sadly, too many of us stay in the realm of ideas, that we don't actually get down to nitty-gritty politics. Because the realm of ideas is fun and interesting. And there's obviously, when we look at the state of higher education in this country, when we look at many of our commanding heights institutions, of course, there is a fight with real stakes going on there. But I think the realm of ideas is way different than the attempt to whip up support for candidates and for pieces of legislation. There are a lot of powerful people in this town, 435 in the House, another 100 in the Senate. And with the Trump administration coming in, the conservative movement is going to have a whole bunch of people scattered throughout the executive branch that are all going to want to have their finger in that kind of pie, getting the wins for themselves, for what they represent, etc. So why did you decide to get out of the realm of ideas and do the, in many cases, thankless, much more difficult work of making sure there's enough votes to get XYZ piece of legislation passed?
Yeah, another good question. Elon Musk comes to mind. When he was building Tesla, he talked about, and still talks to this day about, idea formation is the easiest part of any process that you go through. It's the easiest one. Coming up with a design for an electric car was the easiest thing that he did at Tesla. The hard part is figuring out the manufacturing, and it took him years to be able to do that. He almost went broke 15 times doing it. And there aren't many people in the world who are interested in figuring out those hard questions. And it's not that I'm any special person or think that I'm one of the only ones, but someone's got to do it. Mm-hmm. And I'm really interested, at my core, what I care about is the end result. I don't care about glory. I don't care about honor. I don't care about a platform. I love that people look to Heritage Action as an organization that sort of leads this implementation or trying to get bills across the finish line and try and implement conservative policy solutions. And people should continue to look to us for that. But I actually care about changing the direction of the country. And the activists and the grassroots supporters that Heritage Action have all care about that exact same result. Mm-hmm. And so activating 2 million grassroots supporters throughout the country, 20,000 Heritage Action Sentinels, and our entire grassroots lobbying team at both the state and federal level to accomplish that stuff, and then to be able to go back to them and say, look what you guys were able to accomplish. That's the most fulfilling thing any individual, at least for me, and I think broadly speaking, can be a part of. If you can deliver something or help organize people in a way that they're a part of a process that delivers change for their lives, not just their lives, but our lives. That's one of the greatest accomplishments and sort of things that you can look back on in your life to say, I did something that mattered. I didn't just sit on my laurels. I didn't just pontificate. I didn't just write a blog, although increasingly, as we've seen in this election cycle, that's even more important these days.
Hey, don't hate the blog writers.
But there's the hard work of implementation and convincing members that this is the right thing to do is important work, and it can be rewarding a lot of time. I mean, there's obviously a lot of disappointment, but yeah, it can be very rewarding.
Mm-hmm. And you're hoping over the course of this next Congress to go back to those millions of grassroots activists and say, you guys did this and this and this and this and this and this and this. You want to try to stack as many wins as possible. We are recording this before they have decided what to do with the continuing resolution, what to do with spending, that the federal government's planning to run out of money come December 20th. This is going to be released shortly after that. So Merry Christmas, everybody. First off, by this time, we'll know what they've decided, whether they've decided to kick the can down the road to March or to punt until October. How do you see this current spending fight, and what are the options on the table? You know, if people are listening to this episode and, well, now we have another spending fight in March, what does that mean? Or what does that mean if they decide to kick it to October?
Yeah, good question. March, there's a reason that they chose March. April has a number of provisions that were signed into law under the Fiscal Responsibility Act that require automatic cuts to government spending. And so Congress, in their infinite wisdom, set the deadline prior to that date so that they could pass, or at least attempt to pass, government funding for the remainder of the year, which would essentially turn off these automatic cuts. Mm-hmm. And so knowing that this was the dynamic and the timeline, Heritage Action months ago, when the last continuing resolution was passed, we went to the Speaker's office, we went to rank and file members, we went to Senate offices, and we pleaded with them that in a lame duck session of Congress, December 20th is when this is going to come up, they cannot and should not pass government funding in negotiations with Democrats that control the Senate to essentially hamstring the Trump administration for the first 7 or 8 months of his administration. And so our perspective is we are where we are getting to December 20th. You all have made that decision. The best opportunity that we have coming out of this, whether it be an omnibus spending bill that gets to October, to your point, or another continuing resolution that gets to March, that latter option is the best because Trump will be able to come in. One, he'll have January, February, and about half of March for the Senate to get their act together and confirm the cabinet nominees. So he'll have a good bit of time to get a lot of that done, which is fantastic. And then by March, the appropriators and the folks controlling the purse strings in Congress can put together an omnibus bill or a funding bill of whatever make that they would like to utilize to start to implement some of Trump's agenda. It will be one of the first opportunities that Trump and his administration have to start implementing at least incremental change in the way that we fund certain programs or, importantly, not fund a lot of others. And so we want him to have that opportunity. I would like for that to happen because the alternative is terrible. If we pass an omnibus with Democrats in December, on December 20th, which, by the way, it doesn't look like we're going to do that. But if we did, Democrats would negotiate all sorts of stuff. Ukraine funding that's mandated it would at least be a year, but arguably they could do more. They could lock in restrictions on what he's able to do with DOD funding as it relates to the border. They could restrict what he's able to do with deportations. Endless possibilities to constrain and handcuff the Trump administration. So the only option here in our mind is to get to March, and then they can have another bite at the apple.
Why not say, hey, let's do a CR through May so that you get some of those cuts coming in during April,
Yeah.
right? Why do you think they chose March? Because yes, Senate needs to get their act together, do the confirmations. Then you're going to have first 100 days agenda. It's going to be a flurry of executive activity. Why drop it right there? Is it because in April you're supposed to start the appropriations process for the next fiscal year? And you just don't want to double dip, right? You don't want to be dealing with a CR in May when you're already trying to work on appropriations for the next fiscal year starting in April. I mean, is that the calculation?
There's some of that. The sequestration is a big thing too in April, that the automatic cuts that come in. And to your point, Heritage Action would love to see some of this government funding decrease. We've been advocating for it for the entire existence of Heritage Action since 2010. Congress is sort of it's third rail politics for them to cut an agency, decrease funding, all those kinds of things. But and this is like sort of a fundamental aspect that we don't really talk about as conservatives that much, because it's sort of the dirty part of Congress. Congress is made up, to your point, of 435 unique individuals, and yes, legislative activity is the core functionality of Congress. But in order to be able to do that, first you have to do something called member management. And so Mike Johnson, as Speaker of the House, has to please both a member who won a district that Biden or Kamala Harris would have carried by 1 or 2 points, and a member who has won a district that leans Republican by 34 points. So he has a smattering of people, a smattering of opinions, and they all have parochial interests that they want solved. And a number of those folks are very interested in DoD funding, defense funding, some of the funding lines that would be automatically cut in April. So to get in front of that and to not create, he's going to have a margin, by the way. The Speaker and the Republican majority in the House, they'll have a margin of 2 votes. Mm-hmm. If they lose 2, they lose. And so Mike Johnson has to be very careful about whether we like it or not. It is a dirty part of Congress, and it's not a glamorous part of it. But whether we like it or not, Mike Johnson views his job as having to navigate those dynamics, those personalities, their demands on all these bills. And so the best process for him to actually get at this question of cutting government spending, putting in policy riders, getting rid of earmarks for LGBTQ senior centers, things like that, in order for him to even have those conversations, he's got to be in a place where those folks that are very concerned about automatic cuts to other government funding programs are in a place where they say, okay, we see what you're trying to do here. We see that you're trying to be an honest broker with us while also adhering to Chip Roy's and Thomas Massey's and the warriors in Congress. So he's got to do a bit of a dance. It's a dance. Mm-hmm. And he's got to be very delicate about it. And so March is sort of that Goldilocks opportunity where it's before the automatic cuts. He can show them that he's willing to have and hear their concerns, but he's also going to try and deliver for members of the House Freedom Caucus or conservatives in Congress who actually want to cut an agency into the Department of Education, cut spending across the board at the various levels. So it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. And honestly, we may get to March and they decide to do another CR until September because of all these points that you brought up earlier: Trump agenda, nominees, all the things that he's going to want to do, reconciliation bills. They've got a lot that they want to do in the first 18 months of the administration. So it might end up that we get to the end of September under a continuing resolution. But I think having it in March gives them the opportunity, at least, to cut and to actually implement Trump's agenda. And you better believe Heritage Action is going to be there to hold him to account.
And we saw how powerful individual members could become in the Senate over the past 4 years during the Biden administration, specifically with Sinema and with Manchin. I remember during the debt ceiling negotiations between Schumer/Biden and Kevin McCarthy, because Mitch McConnell was MIA. But in that debt ceiling agreement that Biden struck with McCarthy, there was before Joe Manchin had decided not to run for re-election, there was a Joe Manchin re-election handout, which damaged Biden a ton and it damaged McCarthy a ton. Because here's McCarthy giving Joe Manchin a handout when that was the most flippable seat for Republicans to potentially obtain the majority going into the 2024 election. Of course, Manchin doesn't run. We have Senator Jim Justice now, yada, yada, yada. But on the Biden side of the equation, he's got to deal with Manchin because Manchin's has that much power as someone who can change the outcome of any type of vote on the Senate floor. And now you have a 2-member majority and expand that to not just, 100 members of the Senate, expand that to 435 members in the House of Representatives. So that we saw how powerful those individual members can be when they decide to be. And so there is a bit of a dance. And I think for Johnson, the unique challenge is Johnson is more powerful than he's ever been right now. Johnson hasn't had the powers that I think you've seen other speakers act with in the past, partly because I think it's kind of against his nature, right? He's a constitutional lawyer by training. He doesn't like the type of concentration that I think is currently in the speaker's office, though it advantages him at the moment being Speaker of the House. He's kind of, internally opposed to everything there. But over the course of his period of time, right, he comes in as kind of this consensus candidate to replace McCarthy after a week of chaos. Through every single negotiation, he's trying to put something together with Senate leadership and a Democratic president when the Republican leader of the Senate was constantly siding with Democrats. So every single time he walked in a room with his fellow congressional leaders, it was a 3-on-1, and he's the new guy. And so now he's finally in a position where he has power, and he has more power than he's had before going into these types of negotiations. Right. He's got President Trump at his back. He's got a Republican Senate. He's got a Republican House, right? In an election year where we weren't necessarily sure if Republicans were going to keep the House majority, he has that. And so this is kind of his first time that he's able to spread his wings a little bit and do this dance that you were talking about.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Speaker Johnson, by the time this airs, I think the game will have happened, but he's going to go to the Army-Navy football game, or will have gone by the time the viewers see this, with Trump. And I think that speaks volumes to how this next Congress will go. You have a 2-seat margin. The best tool that you have in the toolbox to get everybody on board is to use the platform of the President of the United States. And with Donald Trump, someone who's just won the popular vote, has a clear mandate from the American people, and he has an entire apparatus around him now that I think will put real hard power and press hard power on these members to get in line. And so I think that is an interesting dynamic. Yes, it will be difficult. I'm not trying to sugarcoat it or say that, it would be easy.
You saw that at the UFC thing too, right? Where like Mike Johnson just looked like so, it's dark and it's Dana White and Donald Trump and they all got this moxie. And there's Mike Johnson in the back, just smiling ear to ear, just so happy to be here, hanging out with Kid Rock. It was a lot of that, And when the truths are coming in on your side, it's always a good thing, right? When a truth comes in and it hurts you, it messes up your day.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think Speaker Johnson, first of all, not a lot of people know this kind of stuff, but, he was at the UFC fight, but for 5 days before that, and ever since then, he is taking multiple flights a day, flying all over the country, one to campaign, one to meet new members, one to be with Donald Trump when he's doing whatever he's doing, to be a part of the discussions at Mar-a-Lago about how the next administration is going to be stood up. So he's flying at all hours of the day. He has a chalk day leading up to the UFC fight, flies all the way to, New York or something? Flies all the way to Madison Square Garden, goes in, does this late night fight with Trump, gets on a plane right after 2 a.m. or something like that, flies back down to DC or Florida or something like that, goes to bed for 2 hours, gets up the next day, does it all over again. So this guy's job, not to give him all the credit in the world, but it's not easy.
Yeah.
It's not easy. And it's not going to be easy, but I do think that there are things that he's tactically using and doing to set himself up for success, like, associating himself so closely with Trump. And listen, Trump knows, And he's done this for he's done this for 4 years now, and so he knows the dynamics. You've seen it already starting to play out. The fact that Mike Johnson is going to UFC fights with him or going down to Mar-a-Lago, I think speaks volumes. And you've seen some of this on the Senate side too. Trump is and understands that an antagonistic relationship with a majority leader in a Republican-controlled Senate can be a really bad thing, as it turns out.
Yeah, he was incredibly gracious when he went and met with Senate Republicans. Remember, they had that luncheon, and he sat next to Mitch McConnell, and it was Mitch McConnell and him talking to the conference. And he says, listen, guys, in 2022, we didn't lose because of me. We didn't lose because of Mitch McConnell. And he really emphasized it's not Mitch McConnell's fault that we don't have the majority right now. And for me, just come on. I saw the way that the money moved around during the 2022 election cycle. Mitch McConnell made a very big bet on Dr. Oz that didn't pan out. And for him to say that off the top to the Senate conference, I think he understands that now, right? 8 years into this whole politics thing that Donald Trump has ventured into. He understands having an adversarial relationship with the Senate leader, not the best for him. And two, he's able to be magnanimous and understands the personalities specifically in the Republican Senate conference, though there's been a lot of turnover, right? A lot of these folks are still, they're not the MAGA firebrands that tend to circle around Trump, right?
Yeah, they're not House members.
They're not.
They have 6-year terms. They're the House is up every 2 years. They're directly accountable to the people. I mean, I worked on the House side for 10 years. It's remarkable to be able to see how much they have to respond to constituents. And to your point, it's not filled with MAGA supporters. There are some, of course, but it's not like the House. And so So Johnson has a little bit of an advantage because of that. And listen, this campaign too, 24, these members were taking up the same exact platform that Trump was talking about the exact same issues, talking about how they were going to implement the America First agenda. They rode his coattails into office this cycle. And I think there's going to be a lot of implications from that. I don't think people can run away and dismiss his views or his points as much as they could previously.
Yeah, I really hope that Speaker Johnson has a really great Airlines Miles credit card, because when he does retire, I hope he'll never have to pay for a flight again, and he can travel the world and just use points to pay for all the tickets. But I think you bring up a great point. We saw in 16 and 20 that when Trump is on the ballot, specifically Republicans in the House massively overperformed expectations. And of course, 2024, it was a similar story. But in 2016, Trump comes into the White House, and a lot of folks on the Hill thought that they had won their election despite Donald Trump. And over the last 8 years, that has really changed. They say, oh, maybe this President Trump guy was pretty influential in me making sure that I stayed around Washington, D.C. And now they're tasked with implementing his agenda. The mandate is clear. The margins are close. There's a lot that this administration wants to get done. And right now, the conversation is centered around budget reconciliation. A lot of folks at home are unfamiliar with the budget reconciliation process, and they also don't know that there's two different budget reconciliation processes on the table, two strategies, I should say, on the table. One is we're going to do 2 budget reconciliations in the first year or so of the Trump administration. The second is we're just going to do 1 budget reconciliation. So I guess we'll start with the easier question. What is the budget reconciliation process? And I'm joking when I say easier question, because it is a complicated, convoluted, very difficult political process.
Yeah. It's, leave it to Congress to create a process like this. Historically, budget reconciliation has been used as a way for Congress, with simple majority thresholds in both chambers, to pass, and I'll get back to that point here in a minute, but to pass a piece of legislation that changes budgetary impacts of federal spending loosely, right? And so that sort of restricts what you're able to do in a lot of ways because not every government policy necessarily has a budget implication. And so a good example or a way to think about this is the House this past year or over a year ago passed H.R. 2, a big immigration bill. It changed a whole host of things, asylum rules, parole rules, how we enforce immigration rules in the interior of the United States, not just at the border, but interior. It did a lot of that stuff. But H.R. 2 is somewhat incompatible, at least under certain people's perspectives, with budget reconciliation because not all aspects of H.R. 2 impact the federal budget. And so let me get back to that point around simple majority thresholds in both the House and the Senate. That's a big deal. The House is a majority institution, so you need 218 votes or a majority of those present in the chamber at the time to get anything across the floor. The Senate's a lot different. You have the filibuster, the legislative filibuster, the last remaining piece of Senate procedure and rules that dictates that you need 60 votes in favor of something to get it across the finish line. Well, reconciliation is an end run around that process at 51 votes. So they could, in theory, pass a number of things at 51 votes, a 51 vote threshold in the United States Senate and a simple majority in the House. We've done this. We've lived through this recently over the past 8 years. It's been an increasing practice of the House because I would argue that Congress is in many ways a broken institution. And so they look at must-pass items like the National Defense Authorization Act, but also budget reconciliation to get any real substantive stuff done. And so the first time Republicans had control under the Trump administration, we tried to do two. We tried to do a repeal and replace for Obamacare.
And that's McCain going...
That failed.
Yep.
And then we did the Trump Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which is the big Trump tax cut bill that ushered in actually a period of really good economic growth for the United States. And if we hadn't been hit by the COVID lab leak, we would have had an economy that was doing very well. All indicators were pointing in that direction, and Trump has talked about this on the campaign trail a lot. So to get back to reconciliation, the House and Senate are looking at utilizing this process now to try and implement a lot of his agenda. And there are a lot of open questions, to your point about strategy, but also open questions about what kind of policies can be included. But the list is long.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you there. When they're considering policies, these are governed by the Byrd rules.
Yes.
And the difficulty is there is a certain cohort of senators, right and left, typically more establishment types, that interpret the requisite budget impact to be there needs to be lines in the piece of legislation that's included in budget reconciliation that says number X has been revised to number Y. So number go up or number go down. If we're spending $2 billion on coronavirus labs in China and we decide to decrease that funding to zero, that ought to be reflected in the text.
Right.
Whereas the issue with something like H.R. 2 is you can draw, and I think a lot of research supports this, and common sense just supports this,
right,
that there's a very clear budget impact when you're talking about shoring up asylum loopholes. Because what is happening with these asylum loopholes? Well, these people get into the country and they're working American jobs and they're paying certain kinds of taxes and they're draining the public fisc in other types of situations, right? And all that makes its way back to the federal government, whether it's through state granting programs, whether it's services provided by the the federal government directly. And so a lot of Republicans are sitting there saying, what do you mean fixing the immigration system has no budgetary impact? Of course it does. It impacts our tax revenue. It impacts the amount of money that we're spending on public services, et cetera. And then there's another group that says, no, I don't see in this piece of text a number that's being replaced by another number.
Yeah. No, it's a great point. So the Byrd rule, yeah, absolutely. To your point, there's a person in the Senate called the Senate parliamentarian that makes judgments on whether these things that you're going to include in this bill.
Probably one of the most powerful people in Washington.
Yes, absolutely. Especially now, right? And going into the next year. And so that person will make a decision on whether it has a budget impact. But to your point, let's take something like illegal immigrants or some legal immigrants send money back to their families across the border. Remittances, as they're called. Well, let's say you did a piece or a portion of the bill dealt with remittances. Would that be allowed? These are questions that I know the Congress will have to contend with, and it's Heritage Action's opinion and what we think is our duty to encourage Senate Republicans to either confront or debate the Senate parliamentarian over these issues, or drive a hard bargain with the Senate parliamentarian. And in some cases, there is a scenario where they could reject the opinion of the Senate parliamentarian and say, no, we're going to do it.
Because ultimately, the Senate parliamentarian, which used to not have as much power as they do now, the Senate parliamentarian has started out as a assistant to whoever presides. Yeah. And that as the legislative rules and procedures have become more complex and opaque, well, very often the chair has become a tool of the Senate parliamentarian. And I'm not casting any blame on the Senate parliamentarian. This is just a natural function of institutions when they become bloated, when they become disorganized, is that the person in charge of making sure that everything remains organized, or what is left of organization remains, usually has a lot of power. But before I so rudely interrupted you twice, you were talking about the two strategies in front of us for budget reconciliation, right? So there's going to be big debates on what actually can qualify for budget reconciliation, but we've heard talks that there's going to be two budget reconciliations, or there's going to be one budget reconciliation.
Yeah. It's an ongoing debate, and we may, the listeners may know more when they're listening to this, because I think there's going to be a conversation between Mike Johnson and Donald Trump at the Army-Navy football game, and they may decide to settle on one strategy versus the other. But at the end of the day, regardless of which one they go with, the American people have demanded that they go big. And it's not, they don't just want a bill dealing with tax reform. They want substantial change to the way the government functions. They want the border closed. They want inflation to come down. They want crime rates to drop. They want folks to start acting in a way that is not weaponizing government agencies against the people. They want spying on American citizens to stop. They want their votes to count and illegals to not be allowed to vote in federal elections or even state and local elections. They want a lot of things that were talked about on the campaign trail. And we can't think, regardless of which strategy they go about, it needs to be a big and massive a piece of policy change, regardless of whether it's one bill or they split it into two and they take one chunk in the beginning of the year and one chunk at the end of the year. It needs to contain a lot of policies, and so it can't just be another chunk of money thrown at an agency to do X, Y, and Z, at least in name only. It's got to be substantive changes to law. It's got to be permanent statutory change, and so. I don't know what they'll ultimately decide, but Heritage Action is going to be there regardless of which decision these lawmakers make, to make sure that they're going as the scope or the Overton window is moving toward the American people, rather than this issue of member management, which I talked about earlier, which seems to drag the bills to a more narrowed focus. So they're only talking about two or three things, or they're only dealing with two or three issues because the other ones were too difficult, too thorny to touch. Everyone had different opinions on it.
There are primaries.
There are primaries, and Trump has openly talked about in front of the Republican conference on the House side, and Elon Musk, that they're unafraid to go back to these members' district and say that they're not helping to implement America First agenda. And so, I think that members are very cognizant of things like that. If there's one thing that they pay attention to other than their constituents, it's people with money willing to spend time and efforts in their towns and their communities to highlight the bad votes that they're taking. So all of that is going to factor into this.
So budget reconciliation, just given the numbers, it's inevitable that that's the process.
Yep.
Right? And from my opinion, I don't think even with the best public relations campaign that you can put together, whether that's for the administration or Heritage Action or whatever, you're not going to get 7-8 Democrats to change their minds on this. They're not going to come alongside to get through, the filibuster to implement HR 2 in the SAVE Act. Right. And that's just the way it is. I think two criticisms that come to mind and are, one, the Trump administration agenda faces an order of operations problem. And the order of operations problem is you are inheriting an unstable world and a bad economy. And if you want to reinvigorate the American economy, the first thing that you need to do is introduce deflationary pressures, right? The number one thing that you have to do is get energy prices to go down.
Yeah.
And you can't have the executive engaging in second phase trade talks with China, tariffs, et cetera. You can't have the president engaged in a renegotiation of USMCA. You can't have the president engaged in the type of executive functions that could bring not only manufacturing back to the United States, but could create a fairer trade market for the United States throughout the world. You can't have him doing that if you don't handle that problem first. Mm-hmm. And so with a mechanism like budget reconciliation, when you're doing everything at once, does that imperil certain aspects of the Trump administration agenda because there's an order of operations problem?
There may be some issues there, but the way that I've been thinking about this is Congress is going to come back. They're sworn in January 3rd. The president is sworn in on the 20th. And they're going to start conducting confirmation hearings for his cabinet starting probably January 4th. Before he's even sworn in, they'll start considering Pete Hegseth and Tulsi Gabbard and RFK and all that. Mm-hmm. They'll want to confirm. They may want to hold additional hearings or maybe other committees that want bites at the apple. So they need to get cabinet nominees through. There will be a lot of activity, especially in the first quarter, leading through April to get all that stuff done, to get people in position to start making executive action, rule-making authorities, EOs, memos to these career bureaucrats at DOD to stop conducting transgender surgeries on service members. Things like that will happen in the first quarter by getting these folks into their agencies. You will have government funding in March, and Congress, notorious for not being able to come together or come to a solution on government funding. It takes a long time to do it, always does, always has been. So they're going to be consumed by that. They're going to try to start the appropriations process for the next fiscal year in March and April. So they're going to be doing all of that work. And then honestly, reconciliation bills, it sounds nice to be able to say, we could get this done in February, and we may, right? And I think the Congress should aim for that. Quicker, the better. But also at the same time, if we're thinking of a big package that includes immigration, reducing federal spending, energy expansion and exploration provisions, permitting reform, border stuff, wall funding, HR 2 style policy changes, Schedule F changes to the federal workforce, allowing the Trump administration to have more authority into hiring and firing career bureaucrats. That stuff does take a while. And Congress, to this point around margins, Johnson's going to have to talk to every single one of his members multiple times to be able to get them in a good place. And
you can only meet with 20 members individually a day. There's only so much you can do.
Right. And I think that there is, now I don't know that it makes it, in my view, the only option, but I think that there is good argument to be made, at least intellectually, that if you include a smattering of issues from here to kingdom come, all of a sudden, these different coalitions of members who care about one thing, that you have defense hawks that care about defense spending. You've got guys over here that care about deregulatory spending. If you put it all together in one package, you create unity and you create buy-in for members that wouldn't otherwise vote for a bill that would allow for quicker deportations, and their image in their mind is back to the first Trump administration and kids in cages and the whole narrative there. So
right. This is the American First agenda. It's 3,000 pages long. This is how we're packaging it. This is how we're marketing it. And you're going to have to give me a yes or no vote on everything that President Trump wants. And if you vote no, you're in deep shit.
And now, to your point, though, there's another argument, which is this whole debate that we're all having right now, to say, okay, maybe there is something that can move in January and February to say, Trump wants to do a lot through the Department of Homeland Security. He wants to start deporting criminals. He wants to start enforcing border provisions and stop people from coming into the country. He wants to complete construction on the border wall, which Biden threw away. There is some argument to say, okay, well, let's just do sort of it's somewhat of a smaller package. Let's give the Department of Homeland Security and President Trump some money that he can utilize to do some of these things. And so there is good argument to be made there. And Stephen Miller and others have been on the media lately saying that they think that the way that they would implement it, they could claim credit for the biggest domestic policy win in the last 50 years. So I think there are competing arguments on both sides, but at the end of the day, it's all about getting the entirety of the agenda across the finish line through reconciliation.
Yeah.
And that's what these members are looking at.
Yeah, and I think you teed up the second critique. So the first one is the order of operations problem. The second is overburdening, because not every member is going to be involved in this process in the same way. Of course, they will be involved because they all will ultimately have to vote on this. But the committees and the members where a lot of these fights are going to be happening are going to be appropriators, financial folks, the budget folks. And I heard a critique recently that you're going to overburden too much of a specific part of the conference to get all the pieces done that you want to get done. And I thought that was an interesting argument. I don't think it should hold water if you want to be a powerful appropriator in Congress, Susan Collins, and you want to be chair of the Appropriations Committee, even though you've done nothing for the Republican conference lately. Sorry, 22 hours a day. 22 hours a day is what we will require from you for the first 160 days of the administration. Deal or no deal. So I don't know. That's just my take, but I think that there is something there. Like the burden sharing issue within these respective conferences is something to navigate as well.
Yeah, it is. There are. Yeah, I don't think it's as big of a deal as a lot of people make it out to be. You can prioritize and decide to not do some things. There are must-pass, I suppose, things that need to get done. And if they want to go through this regular order of appropriation bills, they'll be consumed by that kind of thing. But listen, Congress. I said this earlier. In many ways, it's a broken institution. But I do think the American electorate is awake now and engaged in a way that I honestly don't know that I've seen this in my entire political career. The American people care and are paying attention and are more knowledgeable about what's going on than they have been since I've worked in this town. And so I don't think that they're going to let this kind of stuff slide. So if your concern is bandwidth, there are ways to get around that. There are ways to deprioritize certain activities. There are ways to hire more staff. You can always do that. And just put them in a room, lock them, give them Chick-fil-A every 4 or 5 hours, and don't let them out until they've written the bills and they can start socializing them with the conference. There are ways to get this done. Congress, in a moment of clarity, can do a whole lot of things really freaking fast. And so if they want to get their act together, they can do it.
Mm-hmm. And they're going to have to get their act together in a big way because the map in 2026 on the Senate side doesn't look friendly to Republicans, and the margin for the House is very, very slim. If Republicans want to keep the majority in 2026, what does success look like over these first 2 years of the Trump administration? What is the message that they have to bring home to their constituents?
Yeah, well, I think it starts with they have got to show in a real way, in a substantive, demonstrable way, that they've accomplished a majority. of the America First agenda. I think the American people expect at least half of what he talked about on the all of these folks talked about on the campaign trail to be accomplished by the end of the first year, right? And we've got 18 months to get anything real done. Midterms start, to your point, in 26. Those folks go home in August of that year, and they basically don't come back. I mean, for a couple days here and there, but they basically don't come back. And then you got midterms. And if Trump and Republicans want to have anything to talk about on the campaign trail, they've got to pass this stuff. And so, they've got to figure out a way to get reconciliation done in short order. They've got to get these cabinet folks across the finish line. And I think they are trying to do that. We're having conversations with folks on the Hill right now who are trying to draft some of this language so they can be ready January 4th to try and start putting the bill together, or try and convince members once they're sworn in to take the vote. But it's, prices have got to come down. Energy exploration's got to go up. The border's got to be closed. Illegal immigration's got to come down. We've got to start kicking some of these folks out. School budgets and public services for all these illegal immigrants have got to start coming down. We've got to get illegal immigrants out of our voting system. We've got to change the census data or census process so that they're not counting illegal immigrants in places like California and New York, so that those states aren't getting additional federal resources, or importantly, apportionment and more congressional seats so they can ruin all of our lives. These are blue states that are deeply blue, that count illegal immigrants, thanks to President Obama. These are the things that Trump has talked about on the campaign trail that he's got to get accomplished. He's got to change the military. He's got to focus on lethality. He's got to get DEI and CRT and all these corrosive ideologies. He's got to rip them from their core. A lot of that starts with cabinet nominees and what they can do executively, but a lot of it requires Congress. And so, this pearl clutching over the size and scope, they've got to go as big as they can, and they got to go fast.
Mm-hmm. Well, Congress is playing for all the marbles this go around, and we can't have a repeat of 16 to 18. And so as we look to this next Congress, there's a lot for the American people to keep their representatives accountable to and for, and as well as the administration, right? That extends the administration too. Ryan Walker, thank you for coming on the Signal Sit Down.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sit Down. Before you go, be sure to hit like and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review. We not only love your feedback, but it really does help the show. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works. See you next time.